Hello again. How are you, Sabah?
Good, Alan. How are you?
I'm doing well. So we were talking about how it's hard sometimes to continue to create a new narrative when the inertia to go back to the old narratives or the society just like keeps going back to those old narratives. And I was just wondering, how do you manage to continue to create new ones or to know that you are creating new ones?
Well, I think that meaning it's important that meaning oftentimes narratives they can uh, the, meaning you need to change them, you need to challenge them simply because there's no other way of meaning you just can't live with what exists, and so that kind of helps you or propels you into thinking of how best you can do this, because you have to change them, because how else do you live with them, right? And that I think is one of the factors that helps in some ways. How do you think, meaning when you thinking of all these existing narratives and changing them?
Yeah,
What?
I think that I try to put the work I do to a test. So I try to see if a given story or a given headline or a given even report or something about killed journalists and killed defenders, human rights defenders or environmental defenders, if the way we're speaking about them um, is focusing on their deaths and on the crimes that took their lives, or if it's focusing on them, their work, and what they did when they were alive. So I try to put that to a test. And whenever the answer is it's still focusing on the crime, I think there's still work to be done. And I think there's still narratives to be changed. And I think there's still like this kind of like bring people back to this other aspect of their lives. So I think that's a way for me to sort of have uh, a compass.
True,
Yeah.
true. Yeah. I think it's just that, right? That there are these narratives you can't live with simply because they're so dehumanizing and
Mm.
yeah, disrespectful, and that you know that they need to be changed. And so yeah, but as is always the case that with narratives, the work to keep changing them can sometimes be really frustrating.
Yeah.
Also because you keep trying and you sometimes don't see change. So then what, meaning how does one continue, meaning how do you manage to get past those moments when you begin to question yourself?
Yes. So we've talked about this, you and I, in the past. And I think that one of the things that keeps me going in those moments of despair is just seeing even small things that have made a difference, that might not be the big narrative change that I'm hoping for or the big, cultural change that I think might happen in some years' time, but smaller things. So, for example, when we launched the archive, several family members of the journalists who had been killed came to the event. And I never realized this, but they didn't know each other. So, because we launched the archive of their loved ones' works, they were able to meet each other and to realize that they were living through some of the very same stuff after being struck by violence. So that was one of those unexpected things that happened that sort of gave me oxygen to keep going. But I know you have also experiences of hope and of beautiful things that weren't expected that keep you going. So why don't
Yeah,
you tell us about
absolutely.
those?
And it does get depressing otherwise, right? But it's always just so reassuring to see change, to have meaning, even if it is small, meaning some success that that things have moved, things have changed, and that somehow just keeps you going. That you see the smiles on people's faces. You know that people value what has happened. You can see change in their lives, and like you say with the journalists. So here our work is more around changing this whole narrative around Islamophobia. It's about how young women get viewed, and then when when the girls see themselves written about in the papers, in a very different way. I mean, we've seen the shift in how newspapers used to report about Muslims in the community that I live in, and from there to then have all these young women playing football out there, or other things. It makes them happy, and I think that also helps. So
Wow.
yeah,
And
I think
how,
any yeah, sorry.
sorry, I was just wondering, how do you also manage doing this work that can be exhausting as a woman yourself?
Ah, I, 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 I would think that just knowing that there's going to be change, and I also sometimes fall back on my feminist ideology, and I know that there've been so many women who've struggled in the past for me to be where I am today, right? And maybe they haven't seen the change in their lifetime, but because of what they did and they continued doing, irrespective of whether they saw that change, it has brought me to where I am. So one just hopes to leave a legacy behind, to know that one has contributed, even if it is a small bit, maybe sometimes it's big bits, but whatever bit. But there's no stopping. There's always doing, and knowing that it will have some impact or the other. It's like chipping away, and I'm sure you've experienced it too. So I'd love to hear how you go on with this.
Yeah, so just listening to you, I when I heard you say that one time before, and I thought that now again, it just feels so beautiful that to have this conviction, even if you don't have necessarily proof or like very strong proof that you will see a lot of it in your lifetime. It's just this like blind belief that I think is very moving and I think is very inspiring. Um, I think of the way I keep going, sort of as a lighthouse. So even if sometimes I feel lost or sometimes I'm thinking, is this even worth it? I try to remember why I started it and just like to look beyond my current exhaustion or my current, yeah, burnout. But it is true that I have experienced moments where I feel very drained. When I first began the archive before a team was working with me, it was only myself at the beginning. And I remember that the moment I realized the sheer amount of articles that were out in the world and needed to be preserved before they disappeared, I couldn't sleep. I would wake up at 2 a.m. at night and just sit on my bed with my laptop and just trying to copy paste all the information I could. And it got to a point where it was all obviously unsustainable. But I think that it's very important also to like
Mm.
understand that small work or constant work that you're able to sustain is more important than like very heroic or like even self-hurting job. And I know you've experienced this. You've said to me in the past words of wisdom before about how it's important to say things, but to say them smartly.
Yeah, true, true. But also, meaning one is to say them smartly, but also I think that there are times when one needs to also tell oneself that that you are part of that narrative change, right? So, like when you were talking about how you spent this time in the middle of the night thinking of stuff like this, and I remember that post 9/11, there was this whole lot of Islamophobia being thrown around, and I almost contemplated taking on the wheel, simply because one needed to, because the identity was so demonized, and people didn't want to see a Muslim. And I thought, okay, so I need to be in your face. But fortunately, I thought that there are better ways of asserting one's identity than taking on something which becomes regressive, right? and
Yeah,
and so I think that it's also, one has to also constantly be speaking to oneself, even as one is speaking to the world. And
that's so
also,
true.
yeah, and I'm sure you've done it too. But to be conscious of all of
Hmm.
this while it's happening, so that we don't get caught into that same narrative that we are trying to change. So yeah, so one keeps doing that, and I think it's useful.
Yeah,
And I think I also drew strength from the fact that there have been so many others before me who've helped change the narrative in some ways.
yeah.
And one is just taking forward their legacy in some ways. So one draws strength from them. And I hope that people will draw strength from the work that you and me are doing too.
Hopefully this will serve as some kind of guide, even if just emotional.
No, but it's important, I think, that this work, it can be so emotionally exhausting, that to have that
Mhm.
also that kind of emotional support.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I feel like just maybe before we go, I feel like the dominating narratives are sort of like suction, or like the sea or the ocean, that just like its tide is so strong that sometimes, as you just mentioned it, um, you feel almost like taken away by it, or carried away. So I don't know if you have any advice that I would definitely appreciate, but I'm sure that people watching this would too, of how do you like hold your ground when you feel that you are like being taken away by the tide.
Ye- uh, yeah, I mean, I think that it's like what you do, like when you said that there were these families which came in, and they felt so overwhelmed by the work that you're doing. And I think it's that it's about not limiting that narrative change to oneself, right? It's
Mhm.
also communicating it to people who are like us, so that they're more allies, that they join you in the struggle, and that builds your strength. And even so then when you're tired, you can take a break, knowing that someone else is also going to be taking it forward. Taking a break is
Mhm.
not giving up, right? But to know that you also need to replenish yourself, and while you're doing that, for you to have that, you need to have built so many others capacities to be keeping the work alive, so that it doesn't stop.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's what Parcham is also hoping to do, to have this cadre of activists who will also begin to work towards narrative change.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that just thinking about it right now to what the Defensores de la Democracia does, I think that there's so much to apply to that to our work too, and just the way. So last year we worked with family members of killed and disappeared journalists, and their stories or their narratives had been dominated by the fact that they were the family members of. And again, in shifting that and changing that narrative, they have become human rights defenders themselves. So
True.
putting it back to the test again, it's like, why are we focusing this on the crime again, which impacted them indirectly, and how we can focus it on what they're doing right now as defenders, and how we can focus that on their work. So yeah, I think that every time there's like despair, there's a like there's a way to deepen, or to, as you said, like chisel away and get back to like this is what's not like this is what's being left behind.
True, true. Yeah. And I think that's our only hope, that that it moves beyond us, that
Hmm.
it's so many more people kind of take over this lead. And it can be exhausting, but then we are all here, and we are in this together, for a better world. And I think that too inspires us to keep doing the work we do. Yeah, and
Yes,
to
I
know
agree.
this is about us. It's not only about the outside world. This is us. We need to do this for ourselves, and of course, meaning for everyone.
I think so too. It does have ripple effects. And just before we go, I wanted to say that I really think you're very brave, and I admire your work a lot.
Oh, it's mutual. I really love the work you do, and it's just amazing. It's amazing that you take such risks to be doing the work you do. So congratulations and all the very best, Alejandra. And I hope we meet someday, and we can talk more in person.
Yes, me too, Sabah. Hopefully one day this will become an in-person meeting.
Yes,
I will
absolutely.
I will stop the recording now.
Okay.